On the 6th of May, 2023, inside Westminster Abbey, a woman knelt to be crowned Queen of the United Kingdom. The Archbishop of Canterbury anointed her, placed the crown upon her head, and the congregation watched in silence. There was nothing strange about the ceremony itself. What was strange, almost impossible really, was who the woman was. Because not so very long ago, this same woman had been called the most hated woman in Britain. She had been blamed for breaking the heart of a beloved princess, for poisoning a fairy tale, for everything that had gone wrong inside the royal family. And now here she was, Queen Camilla, standing beside King Charles III at the very center of the monarchy. How does that happen? How does someone go from public villain to crowned queen? It's one of the most remarkable turnarounds in modern royal history, and the truth of it is far more interesting than the gossip. There's no secret room. There's no hidden scandal waiting to be uncovered. The real story is something messier and more human than that. It's the story of a love that started over 50 years ago, was forced apart, survived betrayal and disgrace and the fury of an entire nation, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, ended with a crown. This is how it actually happened. Let's go back to where it began, on a summer day in 1970 at a polo match in Windsor Great Park. Charles was 21 or 22, the young Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, and by most accounts a rather serious and uncertain young man. Camilla Shand was a year or two older, sharp, funny, completely relaxed, and utterly unbothered by the fact that she was talking to a future king. That last part mattered more than anything. Charles had spent his whole life surrounded by people who treated him with careful, stiff respect. Camilla just treated him like a person. There's a famous story about their first meeting, and while it may have grown a little in the retelling, it captures the spirit of her perfectly. As the story goes, Camilla looked at Charles and brought up a piece of shared history. Her great-grandmother, a woman named Alice Capel, had been the mistress of King Edward VII, who was Charles's great-great-grandfather. So Camilla supposedly remarked that her great-grandmother had been the mistress of his great-great-grandfather, and that perhaps they had something in common. Whether she said it exactly like that or not, it tells you everything about her. She was bold, she was witty, and she wasn't going to tiptoe around him. Charles was charmed. He had never met anyone quite like her. For a while, the two of them grew close. By the accounts of biographers, Charles was smitten. But this is where the trouble started, and it's worth understanding why, because it explains so much of what came later. In 1971, Charles left to serve in the Royal Navy, following the path expected of a royal heir. That meant long stretches away at sea, and the era they lived in was not kind to a romance like theirs. In the early 1970s, the idea of a suitable royal bride was very specific and very rigid. She was supposed to be young, aristocratic, and crucially, she was supposed to have no romantic past at all. Camilla didn't fit that mold. She was independent, she was experienced. She'd had relationships, including an on-and-off romance with a dashing cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles. And Charles, young and unsure and not ready for marriage, didn't move quickly enough to claim her. So they drifted apart, and in 1973, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. It was a grand society wedding at the Guards Chapel in London. The following year, in 1974, the couple had a son, Tom, and in a detail that shows how tangled all these lives already were, Prince Charles was named the boy's godfather. A daughter, Laura, followed in 1978. Camilla had become a wife and a mother. Charles, meanwhile, remained single and searching, and the two of them stayed within the same social world, never quite losing touch. Then came 1981, and the wedding the whole world remembers. Charles married Lady Diana Spencer. She was just 20 years old, gentle, shy, aristocratic, and seemingly perfect for the role. Their wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral was watched by an estimated 750 million people around the globe. It was sold to the public as a fairy tale, the prince and his beautiful young bride. But the fairy tale had a crack running right through the middle of it from the very start. because Charles, by many accounts, had never stopped caring for Camilla, and Diana, painfully young and stepping into a world she didn't fully understand, would later say she sensed it almost immediately. It's worth pausing on Diana here, because she is too often reduced to a single role in this story, and she deserves better than that. She was 19 when she got engaged and 20 when she married, stepping almost overnight from an ordinary young woman's life into the most scrutinized position on earth. She had little preparation and, by her own account, little support. She was warm, instinctively good with people, and adored by the public in a way few royals ever manage. But behind the palace walls, she was lonely and increasingly desperate. She struggled with bulimia and with depression, and she felt, rightly or wrongly, that the family around her neither understood nor wanted to understand what she was going through. Whatever else is true about this story, the unhappiness of that young woman was real, and a great deal of what went wrong flowed from the fact that two people had been pushed together who were never suited to each other in the first place. This is the hardest part of the story to tell fairly, so let's be honest and careful about it. According to Charles's own authorized biography, written by Jonathan Dimbleby and based on Charles's cooperation, his marriage to Diana had badly broken down by the mid-1980s, and around 1986 his old friendship with Camilla rekindled into a full affair. Both of them were married to other people. Camilla to Andrew, Charles to Diana. There is no way to dress that up as something noble. It caused real pain, especially to Diana, who was struggling with her own unhappiness, with an eating disorder, and with feeling unsupported inside the royal family. Her suffering during those years was genuine, and it should not be minimized. At the same time, the picture wasn't as simple as one villain and one victim. Diana, in her own later words, had her own affair during this period too. These were flawed people in a deeply unhappy situation, and almost everyone involved ended up hurt. For years, the affair stayed private, the subject of whispers but not proof. That changed in the early 1990s, when the whole thing exploded into public view in the most humiliating way imaginable. An intimate, private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded back in 1989, was leaked and published in 1993. The press dubbed it Camillagate. Suddenly, the most personal, embarrassing details of their relationship were splashed across every newspaper. For Camilla, it was devastating. She was no longer a private woman. She was now, in the eyes of much of the public, the other woman, the home wrecker, the person who had ruined the nation's beloved princess. The hatred directed at her was intense and unrelenting. She was reportedly even abused in public, shouted at, blamed openly. Few people in modern Britain have been so widely despised. The marriage of Charles and Diana, meanwhile, was collapsing in slow motion in front of the entire world. In 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, announced to Parliament that the couple were formally separating. And then came the moment that sealed Camilla's reputation as the villain of the piece. In November 1995, Diana gave an interview to the BBC program Panorama. Sitting in her room at Kensington Palace, she spoke with raw honesty about her marriage, her depression, her loneliness. And she said one line that has echoed ever since. Asked whether Camilla had played a part in the breakdown of her marriage, Diana replied that there had been 3 of them in the marriage, so it had been a bit crowded.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
That single sentence was devastating. It was quoted everywhere. It framed the whole story in the public mind. Diana the wronged wife, Charles the unfaithful husband, and Camilla the intruder. It's worth noting, for the sake of accuracy, that years later it emerged the journalist who landed that interview, Martin Bashir, had used dishonest methods and faked documents to win Diana's trust and secure it. The BBC itself later apologized, but none of that mattered at the time. The damage to Camilla was done, and it was enormous. What followed were the years that should have ended any hope of acceptance forever. Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles, whose own marriage had long been effectively over, divorced in 1995. Charles and Diana finalized their divorce in 1996, And then, in August 1997, came the tragedy that changed everything. Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. The grief that swept across Britain and the world was staggering. And in that climate of overwhelming public mourning for Diana, the idea that Camilla could ever be openly accepted, let alone become a princess or a queen, seemed not just unlikely but impossible. To many people, she was the woman who had stood between Diana and her husband, and now Diana was gone. The wall of public feeling against her looked permanent. Here is where the story becomes something genuinely unusual, because instead of disappearing, Camilla and Charles began, very slowly and very carefully, to rebuild. There was no dramatic gesture, no grand public statement. It was the opposite. It was patience. For years, they kept their relationship almost entirely out of sight, letting time do its quiet work. The first real signal to the public came in 1999, when the two of them were photographed leaving the Ritz Hotel in London together, after a birthday party for Camilla's sister. It was a small thing, two people walking out of a hotel, but it was deliberate, a gentle first step to let the country get used to the idea that they were a couple. From there, the reintroduction was managed with enormous care. The palace understood that Camilla could not be pushed on the public. She had to be allowed in gradually, on terms people could slowly accept. Even within the royal family, acceptance came slowly. Queen Elizabeth II, Charles's mother, kept her distance from the relationship for a long time. There were events she reportedly avoided because Camilla would be present. But that softened too. By the turn of the millennium, the Queen attended an event where Camilla was also present, which was read as a quiet sign that the ice was beginning to melt. In 2003, Charles and Camilla took the significant step of moving in together at Clarence House, his official London residence. Year by year, the public was being shown a steadier, calmer picture, not a scandal, but simply two people who had been together a long time. There was also a quieter, more personal challenge that had nothing to do with the public at all. Charles had two grieving sons, William and Harry, who had lost their mother. Any new relationship had to be navigated with enormous care around them, and Camilla, by most accounts, understood that she could never try to step into Diana's place in their lives, and never attempted to. She had her own two children from her marriage to Andrew, Tom, and Laura, and over the years the two families were slowly, carefully blended. None of this was rushed. The whole approach with both the public and the family was built on the same principle, that trust lost so badly could only be rebuilt slowly, through patience rather than persuasion. There would be no grand campaign insisting that people change their minds. There would just be time, consistency, and the steady accumulation of ordinary, undramatic days. And then in 2005, after 35 years of meeting, parting, scandal, and waiting, Charles and Camilla finally married. It was nothing like the spectacle of 1981. There was no cathedral, no global audience of hundreds of millions, no fairytale staging. Instead, it was a small civil ceremony at the Windsor Guildhall on the 9th of April. The date had originally been set for the 8th, but it was pushed back a single day so that Charles could attend the funeral of Pope John Paul II as a representative of the Queen. Prince William, Charles's elder son, served as a witness. Queen Elizabeth chose not to attend the civil ceremony itself, in keeping with her role as head of the Church of England and the sensitivity around a marriage of two divorced people, but she did host a reception for the couple afterwards and attended a church blessing. It was a careful, modest, grown-up affair, and tellingly, Camilla did not take the title Princess of Wales, the title that had belonged to Diana. She became the Duchess of Cornwall instead. Even in marriage, the shadow of the past was being handled with caution. What happened over the next 2 decades is in many ways the most important part of the whole story, even though it contains almost no drama at all. And that's exactly the point. Camilla, now firmly inside the royal family, simply got on with the work. She showed up. She supported Charles. She took on causes and stayed with them. She became a determined campaigner against domestic violence and sexual assault, quietly meeting survivors and giving the issue a profile it had rarely had at that level. She championed literacy and reading. She supported research into osteoporosis, the bone disease that had killed her own mother after years of suffering, turning private grief into public purpose. She didn't complain. She didn't fight back against the criticism in public. She didn't try to compete with Diana's memory. She just kept turning up, year after year, doing the work without fuss. In a rare interview she gave later in life, Camilla was asked how she had coped with all those years of being looked at and criticized. Her answer was simple and unglamorous. She said that nobody likes to be constantly watched and judged, but that in the end you have to rise above it and get on with life. That attitude, more than any clever public relations campaign, is what slowly changed people's minds. The public watched a woman absorb years of hatred without bitterness, and gradually, grudgingly, respect began to grow. The villain of the 1990s was becoming, in the 2010s, something close to a quietly admired royal workhorse, not adored the way Diana had been adored, but trusted, reliable, steady. The final seal of approval came from the one person whose opinion mattered most. In February 2022, on the eve of the 70th anniversary of her reign, Queen Elizabeth II released a message to the nation. In it, she addressed the question that had hung over Camilla for years, what she would be called when Charles became king. The Queen wrote that it was her sincere wish that, when the time came, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort as she continued her own loyal service. Think about the weight of that. The same monarch who had once kept her distance from the relationship was now publicly, deliberately, blessing Camilla's future as queen. It was the ultimate endorsement, and it was no accident. Elizabeth chose her words with great care, and she chose to use them to clear Camilla's path. 7 months later, in September 2022, Queen Elizabeth died and Charles became king. Camilla became Queen Consort exactly as Elizabeth had wished, and when the coronation invitations were issued in the spring of 2023, royal watchers noticed something significant. The word consort had quietly been dropped. She was simply Queen Camilla. The last little qualifier, the last reminder that her position was somehow conditional or lesser, had been removed. On the 6th of May, 2023, she was crowned in Westminster Abbey beside her husband, the king. There's a strange historical echo running underneath all of this that's easy to miss. Remember Camilla's great-grandmother, Alice Capel, the mistress of King Edward VII. In her day, more than a century ago, a relationship like that was an open secret among the upper classes, quietly tolerated and never spoken about in public. The newspapers did not hound her. The public did not turn on her. The rules of discretion protected everyone involved. In a sense, Charles and Camilla were living out a very old royal pattern, the kind of long, complicated attachment that monarchs had carried on for centuries. The difference was the world they were doing it in. They were trying to live a 19th century kind of arrangement in the full glare of the late 20th century, with tabloids, long-lens cameras, leaked phone calls, and television interviews watched by millions. What Alice Capel's era would have hidden, Charles and Camilla's era broadcast. That is a large part of why their story became such a public catastrophe, and why it took so long and such patience to recover from it. So when you step back and look at the whole arc of it, what do you actually see? You see a story that almost no novelist would dare to invent, because it would seem too unlikely. Two young people meet and fall for each other. The rigid rules of their time and their stations pull them apart. They each marry someone else. They find their way back to each other in a way that causes real harm and real pain, and they pay for it with years of public disgrace, with one of them becoming perhaps the most reviled woman in the country. A tragedy intervenes that seems to close the door forever. And yet, through sheer patience and persistence, and the slow, unglamorous work of simply being decent and dutiful for decades, the door creaks open again, and the same woman ends up wearing a crown. It's important to be honest about all of it. This is not a clean story, and it would be wrong to pretend it is. The affair caused genuine suffering, above all to Diana, whose pain was real and whose early death was a tragedy. Anyone telling this story has to hold space for that. But it's also true that the simple version the public believed in the 1990s, the version with one clear villain, was never the whole truth. The real story was a tangle of unhappy marriages, impossible expectations, and human weakness on more than one side. And what makes Camilla's journey so striking is not that she was secretly innocent all along, because she wasn't, but that she did something very difficult and very rare. She endured. She took the hatred, absorbed it, and answered it not with arguments but with years of quiet, consistent service, until the country slowly decided to see her differently. There is no secret room in this story. There is no hidden box of letters waiting to destroy a marriage. The truth was always out in the open, painful and public, and picked over for 30 years. The real mystery was never what Camilla was hiding. The real mystery was how a woman so completely written off could possibly come back from it. And the answer, in the end, is almost disappointingly simple. She refused to go away, she refused to grow bitter, and she outlasted the anger. The love that began at a polo match in 1970, the love that everyone tried to bury, simply refused to die. And half a century later, it was crowned. Whatever you may feel about how they got there, and people will always disagree about that, the persistence at the heart of this story is real. Charles wanted Camilla for 50 years, through every obstacle the world could throw at them. And Camilla, the most criticized woman in Britain, walked through all of it and came out the other side as queen. History rarely gives us a second act like that. This one was real.